Let's go. What's up, y'all?
Yo, what up? What's going on,
guys?
Shouts out to everybody on a nice Sunday evening. Hope everybody that went to the JD event is headed back or back home safely. We know that it was probably a lot of it was. I'm sure it was a ton of fun, and I want to thank my two homies here for joining me for this this Cthulhu stream, y'all. We're gonna be doing some Lovecraft, and I've got the two experts here. We got the two high IQ experts. We got Exposing Powerful Lies live streams, and the Green Feathers, y'all. Make sure that you please look in the links to the video in the video description, and go to their channels. And so I'm sure everybody watching is obviously already subbed, but especially if you're watching later, please make sure that you sub to their channels, and make sure you like this video, share it wherever you can, and look at the links that the awesome mods, our friends, are dropping in the chat and in the video in the channel description, and support us with Cash App, PayPal, and Venmo, and really appreciate y'all for being here. So, y'all, let's give a shout out to yourselves. Tell everybody listening who is not subbed already. Of course they are, because they love y'all. But tell us where they can find you, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Jared, go ahead.
You mind if I let Feathers go since I'm going to do the intro?
Go ahead, homie.
Yeah, sure. So my YouTube channel, it's my only place where you can find my content. It's The Green Feathers, all one word, no spaces. You'll see my face as soon as you search it. This channel actually just turned 13 years old this year, believe it or not. So I've been making a bunch of random videos. It's pretty much it. It's kind of like my video diary of random stuff. I have art. I have some archaeology, history videos, and nature stuff like that. So
yeah, everybody check out Green Feathers. Everybody check out TGF. He does awesome live stream painting. He has awesome videos. He's the alpha in the group. He's the long term. He's got the high count. So everybody, please check out Nick the Green Feathers. All right, Jerry, go ahead, homie.
Yeah, I love Feathers channel, man. Those art streams have been so much fun. But yeah, so everybody definitely go subscribe to him. So yeah, it's Exposing Powerful Odds. Y'all know me. I expect the mods to be posting my channel link exclusively in the chat, right? That's the only link they're gonna post is the go subscribe to EPL link. But no, I just do, BS videos. I don't, take it too seriously, but I like to have discussions with friends. So that's what we do over here. So yeah, if you would please subscribe to my channel. And
yes,
and
shouts out everybody. Shouts out to Jerry because we had some awesome streams with Through the Looking Glass on the Crucible. Shouts out to Andy BPF and Rachel Based Homeschool Mom. They put us together and we did some awesome streams. Check out his restreams of the ones that we did recently. Also check out Nick. We did a history of Northern Ireland and the Troubles, and please go to my channel and check out those videos if you haven't seen them already. Sorry,
yeah, that was awesome, man. I love that stream. Yeah, so if anybody's wondering why am I here talking about Lovecraft? Well, I was obsessed with Lovecraft since the time I was like 12. He was my favorite author for a solid 13, 14 years. I've not only read every story the man's ever wrote, but I've also read all of his poetry that's been published. I've also read 5 or 6 different biographies on him, and seen most of the films that were made based on his work or even just loosely inspired by his work. So I was literally obsessed with Lovecraft for the longest time. Nowadays, he's not my favorite author anymore. I just loved his stories. I loved the concepts and the ideas, and I thought it was awesome. But as I got older and I started to read like real literature that was done well, I started to understand what all the biographers were saying when they said he was a terrible writer. And I used to read that in the biographies and I would go, what? No, he's not. He's awesome. Like, he's a great writer. But they're commenting on his skill of writing. And, he definitely left some to be desired in his chops, so to say. Of
right, Jerry, I gotta say, I can see what you're saying. And, again, y'all, first of all, shouts out to Jack who sponsored this stream. So thank you so much, homie. And we've been working on this for a while. We've done some good research on this, and it's taken a while for us all to get together and to be able to give you all the content that we, hopefully we're going to give you some good content. Jerry's already, started with that. And I think that it's, from just personally speaking, I think it's important to say that, I read. I'm a pretty wide reader, and that I'm not ashamed to admit that I'm pretty unversed in Lovecraft, and so I'm especially grateful to have you two here to give me to sort of educate me and to educate the audience on some of Lovecraft's biography and some of the intricacies of his writing. And I can see what you're saying about his craft, and I think that there's like 2 parts to that. One is that sometimes the people that are considered the poor writers are often that way purposefully because of style, form, and content. And for instance, my favorite poet Rimbaud wrote that way on purpose, or they have a vernacular that fits the content. And and it's the same with children's stories. I mean, it's important, I think, to go back and read some stories that you read when you were little. I mean, we did last night. We talked about J.M. Coetzee Foe, and that is built on intertextuality, built on Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, which is essentially sort of handed down to us now as a kind of adventure kid story. But going back and reading these stories, it's important to reread them and look at them through a different lens. So I appreciate what you're saying about Lovecraft. So
yeah, his he wanted to be a good writer. I mean, he had a strong love for literature going back to the time that he was a kid. He actually got that from his grandfather. But his prose is so full of adjectives and descriptors. It's just like they're just strings of like run-on sentences and he overuses words all the time. He overuses the word eldritch. Everybody knows that. They actually associate that word with Lovecraft because he uses it so often.
Right.
So that's kind of where the poor writer status comes from. He also was not respected in his day. His writing wasn't. He only saw a very few of his stories actually published while he was alive. A majority of which were published in Weird Tales, which was just a trashy pulp mag in the day. So, at that point in time, being an author, being a writer was considered like elite. It was considered like, aristocrat almost. And if you were a writer of pulp fiction, they looked at you like, that's trash. That's trash. You're not a real writer, right? So he was not respected in his day. And the only novella or book that he ever saw published in his life was The Shadow over Innsmouth, that was published shortly before he died, and it was a very terrible copy. It was real trashy quality printing and typos, and the cover art was terrible. So he really didn't experience any success in his lifetime. And when I go into his life, I kind of want to dispel a lot of the myths and the falsehoods around his life, because for many years, up until the 70s and 80s, there was so much wrong about him that was spread around in the public sort of zeitgeist. A lot of myths, a lot of fiction, and also a lot of stories that were attributed to him that he never even wrote. And that comes to a character basically in his life, a friend of his named August Derleth. He was a friend of Lovecraft and a correspondent with him. They wrote many letters. A lot of people don't know this, but Lovecraft is one of the most prolific letter writers to ever live. He wrote over 10,000 letters to his friends. He was a reclusive person, but he wrote a crap ton of letters, and many of which have been published in their own books. So you've got a book called Lovecraft's Letters to Frank Belknap Long. You've got a book, Lovecraft's Letters to August Derleth, right? So a bunch of letters. And he would help small authors and writers by editing some of their stuff. Well, after he died and, none of his work had been published, basically, this friend group of his that basically called themselves the Lovecraft Circle, they loved his work and they thought it was genius. And they thought it was an injustice that his work had never been published. So they got together and formed Arkham House, and they were the ones to first publish all of Lovecraft's stories. And up until recently, 70s, you could pretty much only get Lovecraft books from Arkham House Press. You know what I mean? That was the only company that published his stuff. But so it's a double-edged sword. Derleth really helped promote Lovecraft to the point that he is now, such a well-known and influential figure. However, he also muddied the waters around Lovecraft by basically the stories that Derleth wrote and maybe sent to Lovecraft for a little bit of editing or just a once-over, he would then write, written by August Derleth and H.P. Lovecraft. And so for a very long time, there were all these stories that completely conflicted with the themes that Lovecraft would write about, totally changed it up, but it was by H.P. Lovecraft, so it really confused a lot of the stuff. For instance, in many of Derleth's stories, you had the protagonist fighting the monsters, fighting the gods, and winning. The elder sign, this like sort of sigil that they could use to defeat these monsters, which totally conflicts with Lovecraft's idea of humanity being nothing. Humanity being powerless and meaningless in the universe, right? Just sort of an afterthought, and these monsters could just wipe them off the face of the planet and never think twice about it. He also put a lot of Roman Catholic themes and stuff into his writing, which again totally contrary to everything that Lovecraft wrote about. So that's one of the myths that I wanted to talk about. I also wanted to talk about, there's a lot of people that think that Lovecraft was into black magic, or he was into ritual magic, or he was a Satanist, or he was into cultism, or he was into... Lovecraft was a staunch atheist, a secular materialist. Basically, if he was alive today, he'd be soy facing to Neil deGrasse Tyson videos. You know what I mean? He was literally the proto Reddit tier atheist of his day. You know what I mean? That was him. He thought that anything supernatural, anything spiritual was for idiots. He thought it was for the dumb, and he was a smart boy, and he didn't need that. The white Anglo-Saxon intelligentsia were too smart for the folklore and the religion of the lower people, right? Like that was his basic gist. So now that I got all that out of the way, I'll just give you guys a brief overview of his life and work. Howard Phillips Lovecraft was born in Providence, Rhode Island, and lived there for most of his life. His father was a traveling salesman named Winfield Scott Lovecraft, and he was institutionalized in 1893 after a nervous breakdown he had while on the road traveling, doing his job. He was sent to the Butler Mental Hospital and stayed there for 5 years before passing away. He was diagnosed with acute psychosis, and scholars believe it came from syphilis. However, Lovecraft's family told him that his father was institutionalized because he was overworked. And Howard held fast to that theory for most of his life, perhaps to avoid, the obvious truth that his dad was a filthy coomer. And, so that's pretty crazy. His dad was in the loony bin and died in the loony bin. His mom actually died in the loony bin too, but we'll get to that. So as a child, he was sickly, shy, frail. He was taken out of school quite often due to his illnesses, many of which were psychosomatic. But nonetheless, he was often bedbound for long periods of time. During these periods of time, he would be assailed by terrible nightmares, and many modern researchers believe he suffered from sleep paralysis. His dreams were filled with unspeakable and unearthly monsters whom he called the Night Gaunts, which he quite obviously derived inspiration from for his future stories, especially in his poem Night Gaunts and his novella The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadeth. He came from a wealthy, affluent family that lost their wealth after Lovecraft's beloved industrialist grandfather, Whipple Van Buren Phillips, passed away of a stroke when Lovecraft was only a teenager. After that, his privileged and wealthy upbringing came to an end, and he lived with his mother and his aunts in a cramped small house that they split with another family. He became very close with his mother, Sarah Susie Phillips Lovecraft, and his misanthropic nature may have been derived from her. Notably, she referred to him as her grotesque son and encouraged him to remain indoors so that people would not be disturbed by him. Yeah, so she actually called him grotesque. I was like, you probably shouldn't go out there. Your face is hideous and they're gonna be disturbed by you. She was also institutionalized in Butler Mental Hospital in 1919. Yes,
That's a funny follow-up.
right. Years later, Susie's psychiatrist wrote that he detected an edible complex in her relationship to her son. Ew. Yeah, they were that close. There was some of that.
That's what I was talking about the other day.
Yeah, there was some definite. I mean, I would not say that they actually were incestual, but there was definitely that sort of weird thing where he was living with her for way too long, and sort of a Norman Bates kind of thing started to develop.
He Christianed her.
Yeah.
Oh boy.
Right. So, her being sent away to the institution sent Lovecraft spiraling into a deep depression that was worsened when she died from a botched gallbladder operation. He deeply mourned his mother, writing, "My mother was, in all probability, the only person who thoroughly understood me. I shall not again be likely to meet with a mind so thoroughly admirable." Although his mother's death was a tragedy for him, it also was the event that finally unglued him from her and allowed him to branch out on his own. He traveled throughout New England, writing journals about his travels, and eventually even got married for a short time anyways, and moved with the woman he married, Sonia Green, to a city that he hated more than anywhere else, New York. Although he was a vehement racist, he married a Jewish immigrant named Sonia Green, who traveled and worked as an amateur journalist and designer. She would send him money while she was away. Lovecraft, having grown up wealthy, was too proud to look for work, let alone actually take a job. So often he resorted to eating nothing but canned beans and coffee, a lifestyle which would eventually lead to his death in 1937 at the young age of 47 by cancer of the small intestine. So yeah, he was, a lot of people, when they talk about Lovecraft, they talk about how racist he was, and they bring that up. And, nowadays when people say that, it really kind of is like, okay, whatever. Lovecraft was really, really racist. He was like, even, it wasn't just like, oh, at that time, people thought like even for his day and age, he was like incredibly extreme in it. And so the fact that he married a Russian immigrant who was Jewish was pretty interesting. And like, what are you doing there? But he publicly stated that her marriage to him was her renouncing her Jewish heritage, which after he died, she said publicly, that was not true at all, dude. Like, I don't know what the hell he was talking about, but that's not true. He really thought that anybody who wasn't Anglo-Saxon and white were subhuman, were not actually people, they were animals. And there's no excuse for him for what he thought, but you can kind of understand where he was coming from, or why he thought that way, because he was raised in this sort of aristocratic, old English nobility sort of family.
Yeah,
And
I imagine that a lot of that came from the fact that his grandfather was a Whipple Van Buren,
right.
whatever the hell his name.
Well, and not only that, but then at that time period, all of these immigrants were coming into America. And, you know, as a kid who grew up with 5 different types of forks at the table, then to be on the streets of New York City and to see these street merchants that, you know, maybe they were dirty, they were speaking, you know, different language. It wasn't the same sort of classy, fancy. So he saw them as beneath him, basically. And his old, you know, that old sort of way was going away. And
not to mention his mother, you know, HP, don't go outside. The cold is a dirty man. It will get you. Yeah. You know, and this guy, I mean, didn't go outside and meet people, I guess.
Exactly. And he was misanthropic to begin with. He really despised people. So there was just so much vitriol and venom, and he used that and directed that especially on anybody who wasn't his same white Anglo-Saxon. So although his work strongly evokes themes of occultism, paganism, and its ancient gods being real living beings, Lovecraft himself was a staunch atheist and a secular materialist and humanist, and was appalled by anything close to spirituality and to the spiritualism of his day. Okay, I already said about the soy facing. He fancied himself a nobleman, a man of reason who could appreciate the intellectual pursuits of science. And though being in good health and of strong, well-built stock, he was a hypochondriac who believed himself to be terribly ill most of the time and was a shut-in during many periods of his life. He would tell his friends of his terrible illnesses, and when talking to them, he would refer to himself as their old Uncle Lovecraft. So his friends would say, he looked strong. He looked tall and healthy, but he would always talk about how frail he was and how sickly he was. And I can't go outside. I'm terribly ill. Oh, come talk with your old Uncle Lovecraft. And they're like, dude, you're like 30. You're like 6'2". Like, what are you talking about? Right? Yeah. So, yeah.
Oh, shit.
His work is, however, a reflection of his misanthropy. They are not power fantasies, but oblivion fantasies and doom fantasies. The sort of reactionary tale of an incel or a mass shooter type. It's okay I wasn't invited to the party because I hate them all anyways. They don't even know how utterly meaningless their existence is. They don't even know that humanity will be wiped away and forgotten, and everything they are means nothing. His work and his worldview not only justify his status as an antisocial loser, but also then position him as one of the rare few special boys that can see through it and can actually see what others cannot. A quote of his reads as follows: "The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of a black sea of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. The sciences, each straining in its own direction, have hitherto harmed us little, but someday the piecing together of disassociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality and of our frightful position therein, that we shall either go mad from the revelation or flee from the light into the peace and safety of a new dark age." Here you can see Lovecraft views himself as special, a seer. He sees what others do not, into the ultimate reality of the world and of human existence, and understands the place and meaning of both. That meaning, of course, is nothing, no point, no meaning at all, besides, of course, enjoyment of the here and now. Typical Reddit-level atheism and hedonism. Your marriages, your happy families, your friends, your lives mean nothing, and you can't even see it like me. His worldview and stories compensate for his lack of social ability, for his fear of other people. Lovecraft was known to venture out mostly at night in a dark coat with his collars up, hiding his face so that he appeared almost as a phantom or a shadow. When people walked by, he made sure not to make eye contact and to appear menacing and scary. He disliked most people and life itself. Clearly, he suffered from a sort of jealousy of what he saw of others' ignorance and lamented that he was born with such intelligence. However, that misanthropy had a limit and did not stop him from making and having some friends. Others he saw as intelligent as himself. Writers who shared the passion for the craft, people like Robert Bloch, Clark Ashton Smith, Frank Belknap Long Jr., August Derleth, and many others. He was reclusive and so carried on lengthy correspondences with them all over many, many years, writing over 10,000 letters, many of which are still around to this day. He ghost wrote a story for Harry Houdini and helped many young authors by editing their work and giving them advice. So that's mainly the notes I had. I already covered his death.
Wow, thank you, Jared. That was amazing. That was really informative. I got so much to say about that. Before we get to Nick, Green Feathers, just some things I'll point out that were new to me, and that you sort of illuminate, confirmed for me. One, that his letter writing. This guy was the prolific sort of proto Zoomer boomer angry letter writer, and I read that he wrote. He was so prolific with his letter writing that he was like second only to Voltaire.
Right.
And I think there are a number of interesting themes that you sort of brought out there. One is that was his family Methodist?
Gosh, I don't know. I don't know. I'd have to look that up.
I think they were Methodist, and I think it's interesting that like you said, he's part of this. He's part of this New England establishment, which sort of goes along with the literary establishment, and yet he was an outsider. I think that's it. Another thing is that he was a pulp writer. He was a pulp. He published in sort of pulp fiction and weird tales, and I think that ties into what later happened in the 20th century with a lot of writers. We've discussed this before, especially with like the Beat generation and the Beat writers publishing pulp fiction, especially like William Burroughs. Originally published under a pseudonym, William Lee. It's where he published Junkie, and then it was a pulp novel, and then later published Naked Lunch under Maurice Gorodias, who was like a sort of a prawn, an early 20th century prawn romance pulp fiction publisher, who published American writers who couldn't make it in America. And I think that another thing that's interesting is that this guy seems like the archetype of like you said, he's like the sallow skinned, sickly Norman Bates guy, Oedipal guy inside his house.
It's like the Columbine kid, like the dark goth, like incel.
Right. He is, yeah, and it's of course it's no surprise to me, his early death. I mean, and I read a bunch about how his family. I don't know, like you mentioned it, and I don't know if it's been brought out or if it's vindicated, but that there were rumors of INCES, with the Whipple Van Buren and the sort of Rhode Island aristocracy, and all that, and then going destitute immediately afterwards, and then living with his mom and all this stuff. It just seems like that contributed in a number of ways. Nick, what do you got, buddy? Tell us a little bit more.
So let me preface by saying Jerry is absolutely the expert between the three of us here in terms of Lovecraft's life, and I'd always been aware of his work. I was an English major in college. I just never really got into his work actually until this spring of 2022, believe it or not. But I was so, I guess you could say, captivated by, like Jerry said, his combination of poetry and prose, similar to Shakespeare, but just fundamentally different in obviously the articulation, the style, and everything like that, his themes, but very, very palpable wording and stories themselves. So fascinating, especially so many of his stories for me personally, just like anecdotally, there's so many like odd kind of things that personally, like I'm into archaeology, and there's all these stories of people finding things and discovering things. Like the first story that I'll talk about, one of my favorite ones, it's called The Nameless City. So the main character, a lot of his narrators, oftentimes the stories are set in different time periods, but they kind of, I would say, at least based on what Jerry has pontificated so far about Lovecraft's life, sometimes his narrators are almost like different fragments of ways that he views the world. Not all the time, but there's times where he himself really shines out through his narrators.
Oh yeah.
And this particular time was kind of interesting in this story, The Nameless City. The narrator is a little bit skeptical, but he's curious enough to follow these ancient manuscripts of all these kind of demonic lore. One particular story that Lovecraft does a lot of, like, I guess you could say, lore linking in his stories, and he'll do that through these demonic manuscripts that a lot of main characters hear of or have reference to, or like a fragment of, and then another character in the story knows something else about. So this particular character, the narrator, The Nameless City, is traveling in Arabia in the desert, following like these ancient Bedouin tales and these ancient demoniac manuscripts, and comes across these gigantic, basically like Atlantean ruins from just like in Lovecraft's world, in his mythos. It's so timeless that it's almost indescribable.
Right.
His time span is not really, like, it doesn't link up with what we would consider to be accurate time. Like, for instance, his gods and his pantheons that came from space is supposed to be like hundreds of millions of years ago, like
Right.
and
Older
even
than the
beyond
mountains.
that, even billions. Yeah. So some of these basically pre-Diluvian civilizations play a big theme in a lot of his works, having to do with like Hollow Earth themes, esoteric lore, occult things like that, sort of like alternative history, things like that. So as this character is exploring these ruins, he's going deeper and deeper, and there's really unusual aspects to the architecture. Again, Lovecraft uses very poetic language in these. Like, you would really have to listen to the audiobook yourself. Really good channel to do so on is called the Exploring Series. Another one is called Horror Babble for Lovecraft's works. I don't really have the time to like sit down and read because of my kids, so I do a lot of audiobooks right now while I'm doing other things, and those channels are great for that. So,
one thing, just to break in, Nick, thing that you bring up about his themes that strikes me is that it seems like his sort of I don't know, his literary landscape and his cosmology kind of comes from, you can see that it arises from what he read as a child. I mean, I Jerry sort of explained this, and I read this in a biography that because Lovecraft was taken out of school when he was young, he was a sickly child, but he had a big library at home, that I can see some of the origins that, I mean, like you were talking about the desert, the story set in the desert, and I can see, the Arabian Nights and Sinbad in his stories. I can see that he sort of mixed his childhood reading in his library with this sort of, I don't know if this is going too far, but with the sort of horrors or the trauma that he was that was inflicted on him when he was young, with his father going into the mental hospital, with his mother being insane, mother, tell your children not to go outside. You're in Rhode Island with a Sam Hyde, and it's like, so he mixes his reading and his literary landscape with these sort of nameless, faceless creatures that I guess arose from the horrors of when he was young. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it definitely does, 100%. And I would say also even some of the characters too. Like, I know his grandfather, Lovecraft's grandfather, did a lot of storytelling to him growing up. And there's one character in one of his stories. I can't remember the name of the story offhand. It'll come to me in a second. But it's basically like Damien from Antichrist. Is like the Omen plot, except it's like Jerry, you know the name of the story?
No, you said Damien from the Omen. That's what I was thinking. You were saying Damien from the Omen.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
or like in the film. Jerry's probably seen this in the film, Trilogy of Terror 2.
Yes,
you ever seen that?
No, I've seen the first one, not the second one.
Yeah, with the character Bobby.
Oh no, I've never
which
seen
is essentially like the monkey's paw, right? And it's like the kid dies, the boy dies, and then his mother like sells her soul and then wishes for him back. And then he comes to the
Right.
door one night and he says, she says, Bobby. And he says, I'm not Bobby. Bobby never liked you. He sent me back instead. Is that kind of
It's basically it.
basically
He's basically like, and the character himself winds up being raised by the grandfather, who's also in on like teaching this kid to be into dark magic, and they steal all the townsfolk's like cattle and kill them in their creepy shack. And you know, there's like these little droplets of aspects of, I'm not saying that those are the things they were doing, because like Jerry said, like there's no evidence that Lovecraft was into that. He was a materialist.
And there's plenty of evidence to the contrary, because in his writing, there's in those letters, you can't find a subject that he didn't talk about endlessly. He talked about occultism and witchcraft. He thought it was nonsense. So it's not only that there weren't.
In that sense, like what Henley said, the aspects of Lovecraft's persona that he puts into his characters, you know, it doesn't necessarily need to match up with like the plot per se, or like what's going on, but it's more like these aspects of who he is, like, and going deeper into these. Oftentimes, a lot of his stories play upon what is called cosmic horror, where there's a particular
cosmicism.
There's a particular word for like fear of being alone. That's what his stories harp on, and I would say draw their ethereal spookiness from the most, is the way in which he very poetically walks you into places via the narrator, makes you feel very alone, like the narrator themselves in those situations. And sometimes they're deep beneath the earth. In this case, the narrator is starting to find hieroglyphs on the walls that are showing things that don't make sense to him. And then basically when he reaches like the focal point of this hollow earth temple ruin structure, he finds like ancient alien remains in the coffins. There's kind of like crocodilian things. And then he finds this whole series of paintings, wall paintings, and really ornate statues and things depicting the histories of these ancient races and things, and how they came and went, and how people arose from that. But one thing that Lovecraft does very interestingly is he must have had a very broad knowledge, at least on comparative history, because he does a lot of tying in his lore with real life history lore, like very, very smartly too. Like he references, I think it's in Innsmouth, like how the fishermen's folk are kind of strange, and they draw on their occult traditions from the sea peoples. And like he's talking about like the people in the Mediterranean from, you know, thousands of years ago, like with the
he was,
you know, building their Minotaur palace people.
He was fascinated by like anthropology, and you know, he read a lot of stories about, you know, other places in the world and history and stuff, for sure. I did want to comment on you said you were talking about sort of the pantheon. His stories sort of create this tapestry. They all sort of link together, not all of them, but many of them link together to form a sort of universe or mythos, if you will. They call it the Cthulhu mythos, which he was actually heavily inspired by another author named Lord Dunsany, who also had the same sort of thing. Many of his stories came together to form a pantheon of gods, right? So with Lovecraft, he does the same thing. And as you said, you know, his gods are older than time, basically. Came from space, you know, they ruled the earth, and then basically they either died or they're sleeping. You know, their time has passed. But there they are, still under the earth, waiting to come back. And basically, there's these little cults that worship them and that are doing these sort of rituals to bring them back, you know, and that once they do come back, like that's humanity's time is then over and they'll reign again. And yeah, he wasn't like, you know, personally involved, but he did like those, that he thought that kind of stuff made for a good story, you know, I mean, sort of occult sort of things. They just make for good horror. But yeah, so that's heavily pervasive throughout his stuff, and most people associate Lovecraft with sort of fish-human hybrids, fish people, because many of these gods, many of these things like Cthulhu, like Dagon, are underwater sort of monsters, if you will, like amphibious. And In the Shadow over Innsmouth is a perfect example of them basically mating with humans to produce a hybrid race of immortals, which honestly, I know, Henley, you said you wanted to get in the Shadow. Nick wanted to, so let's get into Shadow over Innsmouth. You want to take it off?
Yeah, I would say that before I get to Cash App's asking me to verify. So before I get to that, I would say that one thing that I noticed about Lovecraft and in terms of his narrative style and his structure, is that okay? That didn't match up. Okay, is that there are obviously a lot of parallels with Edgar Allan Poe.
Mm-hmm. He loved Poe.
Yeah, and I noticed for instance, in one of I think it was in Innsmouth, he says something about the imp of the perverse, which is a direct reference to Poe. But one of the things that you were saying about his writing style, Jerry, especially, and that I think that one of the differences between Poe and Lovecraft for me is that I don't get a strong sense in Lovecraft, and you got to educate me on this, but I don't get a strong sense that his speakers in the story, like I don't get that the speakers are a substantive person in the sense that it's like, I know he's not trying to be an everyman witness to events, but I get a strong sense of all of the events and all of the landscape that he describes, and his his cosmicism and his other characters. But I don't. Sometimes I'm a little stuck on who the actual speaker is.
They're two-dimensional.
And I think that's a difference. That's a big difference between himself and Poe.
Poe was a better author too.
Yeah, that Poe does a great job of showing us who the speaker is. A lot of times, he'll write in the first person or in the past tense like Lovecraft does, but I just don't get a sense of like who the speaker. And I think that's what makes it a little bit inaccessible to me.
I understand. Yeah, I can definitely. I never thought of it like that, but I almost find that kind of intriguing because it's like being dropped right into someone else's shoes right at that moment that something's starting for them, and not necessarily needing the back lore. And but I see how exactly what you're saying, like Poe, the character, plot, and setting within the first few lines or whatever, within the first few bits of his work.
One of the things about Poe is that his speakers are always, they're always they're either aristocratic, they're conflicted, and they have some sort of there's some sort of it's like there's a disparate disconnect between the speaker and what he's observing, but he's still within the atmosphere that he describes. With Lovecraft, it's like with Innsmouth, it's like, okay, we're like seaside, we're on the eastern seaboard, we're in the northeast, and I get the sort of the language that he conveys with sort of Native American, Indian names of places, and even Cthulhu itself, this like why Cthulhu, and I understand that, but with Poe, I guess maybe it's a little bit more accessible because of the ambiance of the story, but I don't know, that I guess that would just be my disconnect with it. But let's get started with which one did you guys want to do first?
Shadow over Innsmouth. Yeah. Who wants to go over the plot?
Nick, you want to take that one away?
No.
Okay, I got it.
You got it.
All right. I'm just going to read a quick overview of the plot, and then we get into sort of our takes on it and what you guys thought about it. So the narrator explains how he instigated a secret investigation of the ruined town of Innsmouth, Massachusetts, a former seaport isolated from other nearby towns by vast salt marshes, by the U.S. government after fleeing it on July 16th. Hey, that's my birthday, 1927. The investigation ultimately concluded with the arrest and detention of many of the town's residents in concentration camps, as well as a submarine torpedoing of Devil's Reef, which the press mistakenly reported as Prohibition liquor raids. He proceeds to describe in detail the events surrounding his initial interest in the town, which lies along the route of his tour across New England, taken when he was a 21-year-old student at Oberlin College. While he awaits for the bus that will take him to Innsmouth, he busies himself in neighboring Newburyport by gathering information on the town and its history from the locals, all of it having superstitious overtones. The town was once a profitable port and shipbuilding center during the colonial period and the American Revolution. It industrialized in the early 19th century, but began to decline after the War of 1812 interrupted shipping. The Innsmouth South Seas merchant Obed Marsh built a profitable gold refinery, but the town only deteriorated further after riots and a mysterious epidemic eliminated half of its residents in 1845. Marsh also founded a pagan cult called the Esoteric Order of Dagon, which became the town's primary religion. Outsiders and government officials, including the Census Bureau agents and school inspectors, are treated with hostility. The narrator finds Innsmouth to be a mostly deserted fishing town, full of dilapidated buildings and people who walk with a distinctive shambling gait and have queer narrow heads with flat noses and bulgy starry eyes. Both the town and its residents are saturated with the odor of dead fish. The only person in town who appears normal is a grocery store clerk from neighboring Arkham, who was transferred there by chain. The narrator gathers much information from the clerk, including a map of the town and the name of Zadok Allen, an elderly local who might give him information when given drink. The narrator hears repeatedly that outsiders are never welcomed in Innsmouth and that strangers, particularly government investigators, have disappeared when they pry too deeply into the town. The narrator meets Zadok, who, after the narrator gives him a bottle of whiskey, explains that while trading in the Caroline Islands, Obed Marsh, the sea captain, discovered a Canic tribe in Pompeii who offered human sacrifices to a race of immortal fish-like humanoids known as the Deep Ones.
Okay, let me stop here real quick, Jerry. Just to interject, this part of this, this story really struck me for a couple of reasons. One is that the fact that they live in this like seaside place and that the outsiders, disappear, especially the feds when they come to investigate, is true to life. And I've talked before about this place, Tangier Island in Virginia, where this happens. And Tangier Island is known because it's in the Chesapeake Bay and they still speak in Elizabethan English. The island is known to be highly incestuous. There's 2 family names on the island. It's sinking every year. It sinks more.
Dude, I gotta look into this. I never heard of this.
Yeah, it's incredible.
Wow.
It is just like, and they've tried to open it up to tourism over the years, and I don't know how successful they are, but it's generally speaking, and in terms of lore and legend, extremely hostile to outsiders.
Bam.
And you can tell immediately you're an outsider because they don't have the same vernacular.
Right.
This story reminded me so much of The Wicker Man.
Yes.
Because they do the same thing in this, and this is like one of the things that I appreciate about Lovecraft is that, one of his themes is essentially the fact that there's this town and everybody has a secret and they're all in on it except for this one guy.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's one guy that's going to sort of spill the beans. Watch you spill your beans. You remember that in the Lighthouse movie, guys? A24. Yeah. Watch you spill your beans. It's Will. And the lighthouse itself. The lighthouse. If you guys have seen the movie The Lighthouse with Robert Rattinson and Willem Dafoe, is Lovecraft. I mean, with the squid monsters and the octopi and all that stuff. But essentially, you've got the secret that they're all in on, and this is a major thing. I mean, there are a bunch of Netflix movies and movies that have come out recently that are all about a town having a secret, and you just know that the secret is going to involve human sacrifice, and it's going to be that. And of course, it's not new. This is a story of Perseus and who is it? Perseus and Cassiopeia, and offering Cassiopeia up to the Kraken. The Kraken itself has a lot of is seen sort of there's a more squidular version. It's not a word, but a squidular version in Lovecraft. But they always do this, right? It's and the thing in the story that struck me is okay, the people, what's the guy's name? Zadok, yeah. Zadok's and he speaks in almost like a Faulkner-esque vernacular. And Zadok is he's like, look, he's not Southern, but he's like, look, boy. He's like, look, the people here, they ain't Christian, because they want to get their gold and their stuff. They want to get it right away. So they got this little old cult, and they're gonna, you ever wonder why everybody keeps on disappearing every year? Because they're tying them up to a post or whatever and offering them to the, the Cthulhu or whatever it is.
And
So-
not just that too.
so they can have their harvest, right? So they can get their gold or their, and one more thing, the thing that I sort of, my sort of poetic interpretation of all this, I find it interesting that all of these kinds of stories, they always take place on top of some sort of vital resource, right? And this one is like it's like there's either gold or one thing that I find really interesting. And I sort of got this through the lens of that dumb movie that came out not too long ago, Underwater, with Kristen Stewart, is that, there's and The Abyss, the movie The Abyss, which is also sort of a form of this, is that there's always like an underwater, there's an oil derrick or there's something on the bottom of the ocean, and they discover something they're not supposed to discover. And what I get from the underwater monsters and the Cthulhu and all that is that it's sort of representative of like the globular shape of the oil plumes escaping out of the earth. And it's like this thing that is supposed to be there, and that the metaphor is that, humans are discovering something and it's going to wreck them, and it's going to incite their greed and their lust, and and that it becomes this monster in and of itself. So anyway, that's my sort of interpretation of it.
Okay, so anyway, so this sea captain. Oh no, that was great. This
I didn't think of that. I was like,
wait, what's okay? This sea captain, Obed Marsh, basically he discovers this tribe of people that are offering human sacrifices to this underwater race of beings called the Deep Ones, right? This tribe also bred with the Deep Ones, producing hybrid offspring, which have the appearances of normal humans in childhood and early adulthood, but eventually slowly transform into the Deep Ones themselves and leave the surface to live in ancient undersea cities for eternity. When hard times fell on the town, the esoteric order of Dagon performed similar sacrifices to the Deep Ones in exchange for wealth in the form of large fish hauls and unique jewelry. So that's the thing. So like, the gold they're getting is actually a payment from the Deep Ones, right? So if they weren't sacrificing humans to begin with, but once the recession hits, once the depression hits, then all of a sudden they have to start doing the sacrifices, and basically then these underwater gods would just push a bunch of fish on their shore, or push a bunch of gold and jewelry on their shore, right? So let's see, where was I? So when Obed and his followers were arrested, the Deep Ones retaliated by swimming up the Manaxet River, attacking the town and killing more than half of its population. The survivors were left with no other choice than to join the esoteric order of Dagon and continue Obed Marsh's practices. Male and female inhabitants were forced to breed with the Deep Ones, producing hybrids who, upon maturing, permanently migrate underwater to live in the city of Yaha-Nathleel, which is located underneath Devil's Reef. The town is now dominated by Obed's grandson, Barnabas Marsh, who is almost fully transformed into a Deep One. Zadok explains that these ocean dwellers have designs on the surfaces and have been planning the use of shoggoths to conquer or transform it. Zadok sees strange waves approaching the dock and tells the narrator that they have been seen, urging him to leave the town immediately. The narrator is unnerved, but ultimately dismisses the story because he's just a drunk hobo. So he's like, "Who does he? What? Okay, yeah." The town's having sex with fish and having fish babies. Got it.
Of course, it's always the fool or the drunken hobo that is the wise one in every story, right? Listen to this dude, man. He's not just babbling on. You got to listen to this guy.
Right. So once he leaves, Zadok disappears and is never seen again. After being told that the bus is experiencing engine trouble, sorry, that bus you wanted to leave on, something's wrong with that one.
Yeah.
The narrator has no choice but to spend the night in a musty hotel, the Gilman House. While attempting to sleep, he hears noises at his door as if someone is trying to enter, but not just noises. It sounds almost like fish noises, like flapping of fins and stuff. Wasting no time, he escapes out a window and through the streets while a town-wide hunt for him occurs, forcing him at times to imitate the peculiar walk of the Innsmouth locals as he walks past search parties in the darkness. Eventually, he makes his way towards the railroad tracks and hears a procession of the Deep Ones passing in the road before him. Against his judgment, he opens his eyes and he sees the creatures. He finds that they have gray-green skin, fish-like heads, and unblinking eyes, gills on their necks and webbed hands, and communicate in unintelligible croak-like noises. Horrified, the narrator faints, but wakes up at noon the next day alone and unharmed. After reaching Arkham and alerting government authorities about Innsmouth, the narrator discovers that his grandmother, Eliza Orne, was related to Obed Marsh's family. Although the origins of her mother were unclear, the narrator's uncle Douglas Orne had previously visited Arkham to research his ancestry before killing himself by gunshot. After returning home to Toledo, the narrator begins researching his family tree and discovers that he is a descendant of Obed Marsh through the second wife, and it's some like unspeakable name, Fatalieli. And in 1930 begins to gradually transform into a Deep One. He begins having dreams of his grandmother and this name, which was damaged but not destroyed by the submarine attack. They explain that the Deep Ones will remain underwater for the time being, but will eventually return to invade the surface world for the tribute Great Cthulhu craved. After briefly glimpsing a Shoggoth, which is one of these monsters, in one of his dreams, he awakens to find that he has fully acquired the Innsmouth look. So he starts to take on that sort of narrow head, bulgy-eyed look, right? He becomes suicidal and purchases an automatic, an antiquated term for a semi-automatic pistol, to shoot himself, but cannot bring himself to do it. As the narrator concludes his story, he suffers a mental breakdown and actually embraces his fate. He decides to break out his cousin, who is even further transformed along than him, from a sanatorium in Canton and take him to the underwater city. So the story, the whole time he's like, this outsider, oh my God, what's going on? And then he wonders why they don't kill him when the whole town's searching for him. And then at the very end, he's like, I'm going to go break my cousin at the mental hospital, who is another fish monster. And he's like, and we will dive into the depths and live in the underground sea forever. And like, that's the end of the story. Like,
right. So he's the outside insider. Right, he goes to break his brother Squidward out of the Arkham Asylum.
Yes.
Right, so
that's the longest story that I think any of us have picked. That's the actual novella that he wrote.
Yeah, I think there's Jason in the chat brings up a good point that it reminded him. Some things reminded him of There Will Be Blood, and there was an aspect of There Will Be Blood in the movie There Will Be Blood. In one of these, I wrote a note. I think it was in this one. It was either in this or Cthulhu, you guys, where a sibling showed up, but it wasn't his sibling. It was somebody claiming to be a sibling. Was it in this? Maybe it was in this, but the same thing happens in There Will Be Blood. It's like people will, when they have these resources and the people will degenerate into the most like satanic machinations, right, in order to get a piece. And it's interesting that in the end, this guy turns out to be one of them. I thought that was pretty interesting.
Yes. Yeah. I love that story. It's so creepy, just the way it's written. It's a very, that's what I always loved about Lovecraft, is whether or not he was a good author, skill wise, his stories, a lot of them and the best of them are really truly unsettling and creepy and fun to read.
Nick, tell us about what are your thoughts on, okay, this is a weird question, but one of the things that you can't help but think when you read Lovecraft, especially as a newbie like me, is that these globulous octopi, gigantic creatures are always, rising from the sea. And there's obviously some sort of an element of like, it's almost like he's trying to make the evolutionary metaphysical. And it's always like they're billions of years old, and then they give birth or they create human beings. And I wonder what's the connection here between that and this sort of like evolutionary pond scum element of what he's saying about human nature.
That's very interesting. Well, if you think of it like an octopi is almost travels like a cloud in the water, almost like how his octopi gods travel through space, like big clouds, these big globular. Some of them are even described like if the narrator is in their presence, the human eye can't even fully process the form of it, but they can approximate and make comparisons, draw comparisons to what they do know. But so many of these eldritch horrors and these entities are described as almost indescribably horrible. But then Lovecraft will, in the next part, proceed to go into details about the tentacles and all these things. But in terms of the function of something of that shape with so many arms arising from a depth, the way in which they kill their prey, they completely encompass them and bring them into themselves and drag their prey down.
Right. So the symbolism there,
that's one of those things that I almost feel like Lovecraft took that sensation from perhaps the way that his mother made him feel, or something like, and whatever, some aspect of him, that particular theme of the octopi kind of entity, or like there is a lot of repetition of that, or of these globular beings, or these all-encompassing, horrible, gigantic, nightmarish, like Empire State Building size building, like, monsters that live under the ocean that these people find and awaken and stuff. It's really interesting that it's something deep down that's a big problem. That's like this thing that the narrator has and then discovers, and then it awakens.
Nobody knows about it.
Yeah. The symbolism, I can't help also but think of the symbolism correlating with, it's like what Jay says about in his analysis of Spectre, right? And the symbol of Spectre and the intelligence agencies is the octopus, and it's like, and the symbolism with this seems to be that that they have these tentacles, because the tentacles are not only wrapping individuals and taking the individuals as a sacrifice or whatever, but it's also like, even when the townspeople are not confronted with the actual monster, the tentacles reach into sort of every aspect of their lives, of their society. And so they always feel this like sucking motion, dragging them into the sea. It's this all encompassing, like overshadowing monster. And also you mentioned space. And I think that, it's like in the film, The Abyss, right? It's like that space is the final fake and gray frontier, when it's actually the ocean is the abyss, right? And there's you guys remember like I remember a few years ago when like those who knows if it's real, but those like Japanese sailors were like off the coast of Japan, and they discovered that gigantic 200-foot long squid, right? That had always been in the popular mind, the consciousness of sailors, that there were these monsters, and then there it is.
They finally discover it,
right? And I think that obviously the abyss in this, Jerry tied this in his introduction to the fact that people, I guess, will claim that that Lovecraft himself was a Mason, or his dad was a Mason or something. But in reality, I think that in a way it's almost a moot point, because he gets to the truth of these secret societies and their orders, and how like the secret, the Order of Dagon is like the only one that has a direct line to the monster and can communicate with it. And who was it that it wasn't Gerald Kelly, it was the guy that wrote the book after the death of, it was in the 50s, it was after the death of Lovecraft. Oh, it was Kenneth Grant. Kenneth Grant wrote a book basically saying that Crowley and Lovecraft didn't know each other personally, but that they knew each other in a sort of a, I don't know, inverted spiritual sense, and that's directly applied to like the Typhonian order, like the original OTO, and how they were both sort of saying the same thing. They were both talking about, Crowley talks about like crossing the abyss, like in Paradise Lost, when Satan crosses the abyss, and in the midst of like magical workings, confronts the beast of the abyss and Typhon. And that seems to be exactly what Lovecraft is talking about,
That's a really good point. That's a really good point because Lovecraft wasn't involved in the occult, but occultists love Lovecraft.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, in fact, there's a book actually of sigil magic called the Necronomicon that this guy Simon, I believe that's the author's name is just Simon. He produced a book for ritual magic purposes, all about the Lovecraft gods, basically, and made sigils for him and stuff. So people really, that confuses a lot of people where they think that the Necronomicon, as written in many of his stories, is an actual book and is actually, and so this guy produces an actual book. But yeah, no, many occultists have taken inspiration from Lovecraft and really appreciated him. Even people like H.R. Giger, right? Giger loved Lovecraft. Crowley, who else? What's his name? Robert Anton Wilson. A lot of those guys. Yeah.
Yeah. So Lovecraft isn't, factually, involved in his life, but nevertheless, what he writes about hits at this truth, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is
and the
that,
worldview kind of too.
right,
The worldview is also similar.
Exactly, which is that there is an elite, and then there's a secret society or a cabal, and that the darker, that getting in touch with the darker nature of these demons, right, is what, like, that the average person in his town, they have no grounding. They give up their. It's interesting how, like, the Order of Dagon, like it's specifically described in the text how they give up their Christian robes, right, and the Christian rites, and they just change it into this satanic order, right?
Yeah.
Where now they are making ritual sacrifices of human beings to receive something temporary.
Right. Worldly, earthy.
Right.
Gold, jewelry. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's very much sort of the truth is in there, and we see this a lot in writing and works of art that are not made by Christians, but nevertheless the sort of themes that are true sort of come through without even their knowledge, right?
Yeah, he even mentions in that story it's on page 224 in this book. He mentions in the story, he mentions demons by name, and he talks about how the sacrifices occur at Halloween and May Day, right? So it's Samhain and Walpurgisnacht. And he says, there's a paragraph here where he says, poor Matt, he always was aging it. Tried to line up the folks on his side and had long talks with the preachers. No use. They run the congregational parson out of town, and the Methodist feller quit. Never did see Resolve Babcock, the Baptist parson, again. Wrath of Jehovah. I was a mighty little critter, but I heard what I heard and seen what I seen. Dagon and Ashtoreth, Belial and Beelzebub, golden calf and the idols of Canaan and the Philistines, Babylonish abominations, many tekel parson. Right. I mean, so.
He knew these things.
Yeah.
He didn't believe in them, but he was very well read. He knew a lot of mythology. He knew a lot of comparative religion.
Demonology.
You know what I mean? Demonology. He was fascinated by that stuff. He didn't think it was real or that it existed, but I mean, that stuff is just fascinating. And somebody that read as much as Lovecraft, because he was a shut-in for most of his life. And he got his love of reading from his grandfather, who had a massive library of all sorts of different topics, including sort of occult, supernatural stuff like that. So he was very familiar.
It's weird how he wouldn't believe this stuff, right?
Remember,
Nick, you mentioned like that his mother, that the octopus sort of maybe resemble like it is, and I think he, if anything, I would assume, I don't know, but I would assume that. At the very least, he's looking at things in sort of a Freudian or a Jungian sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
That his own childhood gave birth, like the abyss and the monsters of the abyss are brought out in his. He has a lot about dreams in his text. So they're brought out in his dreams of his subconscious mind, and that his mother is constantly reaching into his life, right? Or that his family has far-reaching.
Or even that the places are representative of aspects of like his mother, like him feeling alone and so deep and submerged in like the ocean, but like the beings that are like spermifying the planet, these gigantic, kind of tentacled beings are kind of maybe representative of his father, who was sent to the madhouse and stuff.
Right.
He was
Right.
young. So it's like he has these two chaotic elements of aspects of how those elements made him feel and played into his life and shaped his worldview as, like Jerry said, kind of that incel, shut in,
Right.
wound up living with his mom and dying with, alone from his
with his
stomach
ants.
and everything. Yeah, and
Right. Yeah.
that's not really the type of lifestyle that I don't think any of us watching
Right.
are looking up to. So
Yeah.
in that
And
sense,
you said it was
Yeah,
Right.
go outside, bro.
right.
It's
For
just
real.
girlfriend, man. Go outside and talk to your friends.
exactly.
Man. Go to
For real.
church.
Don't be like Lovecraft, guys.
Yeah, you said it was surprising that he didn't believe in that stuff, but you have to remember the time period. Science and the idea of all these scientific advancements was so huge, and Lovecraft was biased, and he had a sort of a reason to believe in these things because it backed up his own worldview, his own sort of Darwinian,
He probably
materialistic
would have been a
worldview.
fan of the eugenics movement.
Oh, he
then.
was. He
Yeah,
was
I could imagine
100%.
him.
He was a
Wasn't
fan
he
of Hitler too.
Yeah, wasn't he
I can
actually a
imagine-
legitimate
yeah, I can
eugenicist? Wasn't he?
Oh
He
yeah.
was actually, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like he was of any sort of power. He was a nobody in his life, but he loved that stuff 100%.
But even at the turn of the into the 20th century, I mean that in the Victorian era and the Edwardian era, that science was burgeoning, like you said, but there wasn't this dichotomy. I mean, well, not that there's a dichotomy now, right? Because science is looked at as in a
He
metaphysical.
viewed it as the Western sort of Anglo-Saxon intelligent thing, though. Like that
Right.
was the religion of the white race in his eyes, right? It was science. You know what I
Right.
mean? We didn't need the superstition. We have the scientific method. You know what I mean?
We don't need that poppycock.
Right. Yeah, so I know you wanted to cover Call of Cthulhu. I have a few stories I would like to cover. Which ones you guys want to get into next?
Let's go to Call of Cthulhu.
All right.
Because I thought this was interesting because right away he mentions theosophy. And I thought that was, again, very interesting. And it's, again, this idea that in the 19th century, burgeoning science is sort of wrapped up and mixed in with the occult.
Right.
And again, that's where my sort of disconnect comes with this guy. It's like he's everything he says sort of toes the line of this theosophical idea of science and the occult, and yet he is this atheist. I guess that shouldn't be a shouldn't be a disconnect, right?
This is the thing. If you read his stories, yes, that's what you feel. Read his letters. That's
Okay.
If you want that to make sense, read his
Right.
letters because he explains all of where he actually
Right.
stands versus what he puts in because he thinks it sounds cool or it makes for a good story.
He
you
says,
know, but yeah, theosophy. Sorry, I'll to cut you off just real quick. Theosophy, just like you said, with science burgeoning, theosophy was also huge at that day, and spiritualism was huge at that day. So you had both of these things sort of going on at the same time.
Right. Yeah. He says on the second page of the story, the Call of Cthulhu, and it interests me, the sort of etymology that he creates, right, with his place names and his monster names and his sort of his cosmic idea of these monsters, and it's obviously onomatopoetic. It's supposed to be an unlanguage. It's like a guttural, indecipherable language from the depths of the abyss.
Tulu Fatagan.
Yeah, that to me is straight up Crowleyan. That is like pure Goetia. So I can see why he does that. He says theosophists have guessed at the awesome grandeur of the cosmic cycle wherein our world and human race form transient incidents. They have hinted at strange survivals in terms which would freeze the blood if not masked by a bland optimism. But it is not from them that there came the single glimpse of forbidden eons, the Crowleyan aeon, which chills me when I think of it and maddens me when I dream of it. That right there, the language right there. Again, it's what you were saying, Jerry, is that he's telling us how he feels about it, but I can't grasp, I can't grasp how he is as a human being. That glimpse, like all dread glimpses of truth, flashed out from an accidental piecing together of separated things. In this case, an old newspaper item in the notes of a dead professor. I hope that no one else will accomplish this piecing out. Certainly, if I live, I shall never knowingly supply a link in so hideous a chain.
Mhm.
So we know
I
that he's,
love that.
he's going to. I
Yeah.
think the professor too intended to keep silent regarding the part he knew, and that he would have destroyed his notes had not sudden death seized him. This is like a Masonic idea of silence is golden, right?
Hmm.
And we know that the silence will be broken. So, one of y'all want to take us through what happens in the Call of
Yes.
Cthulhu?
May I? All right.
Go ahead. Sir.
The story's narrator, Francis Wayland Thurston, recounts his discovery of various notes left behind by his great uncle, George Gamble Angle, a prominent professor of Semitic languages at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, who died during the winter of 1926, suspecting eldritch goings-ons after being bumped into by a nautical-looking Negro. The first chapter, The Horror in Clay, concerns a small bas-relief sculpture found among the notes, which the narrator describes. My somewhat extravagant imagination yielded simultaneous pictures of an octopus, a dragon, and a human caricature. A pulpy, tentacled head surmounted a grotesque and scaly body with rudimentary wings. This sculpture is the work of Henry Anthony Wilcox, a student at the Rhode Island School of Design, who based his creation on a delirious dream of great cyclopean cities, of titanic blocks and sky-flung monoliths, all dripping with green ooze and sinister with latent horror. References to both Cthulhu and Rillier are included in letters written by Wilcox. Angle also discovers reports of auteur mental illnesses and outbreaks of group folly or mania around the world. In New York City, hysterical Levantines mob police. In California, a theosophist colony dress in white robes while awaiting a glorious fulfillment. The second chapter, The Tale of Inspector Legrasse, discusses the first time the professor had heard the word Cthulhu and had seen a similar image. At the 1908 meeting of the American Archaeological Society in St. Louis, a New Orleans police official named John Raymond Legrasse asked the assembled antiquarians to identify an idol carved from a mysterious greenish-black stone. Legrasse had discovered the relic months before in the swamps south of New Orleans during his raid on a supposed voodoo cult. The idol resembles Wilcox's sculpture and represented a thing which seemed instinct with a fearsome and unnatural malignancy, was of a somewhat bloated corpulence, and squatted evilly on a rectangular block or pedestal covered with undecipherable characters. On November 1st, 1907, Legrasse led a party of fellow policemen in search of several women and children who had disappeared from a squatter community. The police found the victims' oddly marred bodies being used in a ritual where 100 men, all of a mentally aberrant type, were braying, bellowing, and writhing, and repeatedly chanting the phrase Finglui Magla Cthulhu Ralia Fatag. And I actually put that in the chat so y'all could see the letters, so you can't pronounce this stuff. After killing 5 of the participants and arresting 47 others, Legrasse interrogated the men before learning the central idea of their loathsome faith. They worshipped, so they said, the great old ones who lived ages before there were any men, and formed a cult which had never died, hidden in distant wastes and dark places all over the world, until the time when the great priest Cthulhu, from his dark house in the mighty city of Rillier under the waters, which should rise and bring the earth again beneath his sway. Someday he would call, when the stars were ready, and the secret cult would always be waiting to liberate him. The prisoners identify the confiscated idol as Cthulhu himself, and translate their mysterious phrase as, in his house at Rillier, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming. One particularly talkative cultist, known as Old Castro, named the center of their cult as Irem, the city of pillars in Arabia, and referred to a phrase in the Necronomicon, that is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange aeons even death may die. One of the academics present at the meeting, William Channing Webb, a professor of anthropology at Princeton, states that during an 1860 expedition to the western coast of Greenland, he encountered a singular tribe of degenerate Eskimos whose religion, a curious form of devil worship, chilled him with its deliberate bloodthirstiness and repulsiveness. Webb claims the Greenland cult possessed both the same chant and a similar hideous fetish. Thurston, the narrator, reflects that my attitude was still one of absolute materialism, as I wish it still were. In the third chapter, The Madness from the Sea, Thurston reads an article dated April 18th, 1925 from the Sydney Bulletin, an Australian newspaper. This article reports the discovery of a derelict ship in the Pacific Ocean with only one survivor, a Norwegian sailor named Gustav Johansen, second mate on board the ship Emma, a schooner which originally sailed from Auckland, New Zealand. On March 22nd, the Emma encountered a heavily armed yacht, the Alert, crewed by a queer and evil-looking crew of Kanakas and half-castes from Dunedin. After being attacked by the Alert without provocation, the crew of the Emma killed everyone on board, but lost their own ship in the battle. Commandeering their opponent's vessel, the surviving crew members travel and arrive at an uncharted island in the vicinity of 47... I don't know how to read GPS coordinates or whatever. With the exception of Johansson and a fellow sailor, who then died as they made their way back to Auckland, New Zealand, due to madness from seeing whatever was on that uncharted island, the remaining crew members perish on the island. Johansson never reveals the cause of their death. Thurston travels to New Zealand and then Australia, where at the Australian Museum, he views a statue retrieved from the Alert with a cuttlefish head, dragon body, scaly wings, and hieroglyphed pedestal. While in Oslo, Thurston learns that Johansson died suddenly during an encounter with two Lascars near the Gothenburg docks. Johansson's widow provides Thurston with a manuscript written by her late husband, which reveals the fate of everyone on board the Emma. The uncharted island is described as a coastline of mingled mud, ooze, and weedy cyclopean masonry, which can be nothing less than the tangible substance of Earth's supreme terror, the nightmare corpse city of Rillier. The crew struggle in comprehending the non-Euclidean geometry of their surroundings when one of the sailors accidentally opens a monstrously carven portal. He releases Cthulhu. It lumbered slobberingly into sight and gropingly squeezed its gelatinous green immensity through the black doorway. That's the over descriptors, as I said. The stars were right again, and what an age-old cult had failed to do by design, a band of innocent sailors had done by accident. After vigintillions of years, great Cthulhu was loose again and ravening for delight. Before fleeing with his crew members, almost all of whom were killed, Johansson describes Cthulhu as a mountain that walked or stumbled. Johansson and a sailor named Bryden climb aboard the yacht before sailing away. However, Cthulhu dives into the ocean and pursues their fleeing vessel. Fortunately, Johansson turns his yacht around and rams it into the creature's head, which bursts with a slushy nastiness as of a cloven sunfish, only to immediately begin regenerating. The Alert escapes from Rillier, with Bryden having gone insane and dying soon afterwards. After finishing the manuscript, Thurston realizes he is now a possible target, thinking, I know too much, and the cult still lives.
Yeah, so he, in other words, he finds this idol, right? He finds this obelisk idol, and thank you for that, Jerry. I appreciate that.
Dude, I just lost it. That was so funny.
He was weak because somebody said Sonic Coon. Because Thurston Moore from Sonic Coon was the.
I'm sorry.
No. So, all right. So, tell us about, Jerry? Tell us about this idol. You know, what is it? What is this? What does this represent? I mean, obviously, we read into it like the. One of the things I find interesting about this is this sort of like you mentioned, the non-Euclidean angles of the idol, right? And how it's
otherworldliness, you know.
It's otherworldly. It sort of defies physics. It defies our natural view of shapes and figures. And I guess that's because of the otherworldly, abyssal aspect of like this sort of TGF you mentioned earlier, the antediluvian monstrosities that exist like before human beings. So what is this? Like, what does this open up to humankind? What are they seeing, and what does it represent?
Well, you meant the statue?
Yeah, the statue.
Yeah, so the statue, I almost kind of envisioned it like that, those pillars from the Fifth Element, where it was like almost like an effigy infused with this power, right? Where it's almost like this keystone that had that particular material within the Cthulhu mythos,
right,
is supposed to have come from the planet that he came from.
Uh-huh.
So that's why all the archaeologists that are looking at it and the professors
they don't know what stone it is.
Don't know what it's made of. Yeah,
right.
And that's the case with a few different interesting.
That's really fascinating.
Yeah.
I always thought that was just like some underwater rock. That's cool. Oh, that makes a lot more sense, right?
Yeah,
it came from the planet.
Yeah, it came from the planet, and that's there's a few things like that in the lore too.
Mm-hmm.
from a few other books that I was like, oh, that's from that, and that's why I got so. Even though I just discovered his work, I'm not heard of, but just started really appreciating his work this year. I got so sucked into it because it's so easy to make those connections between all his different works, and there's so many. He's just so good at lore building and world.
Right.
Yeah.
Isn't Typhon one of the? Is that one of the moons of Saturn?
Yeah.
And I think I read that. Didn't they name like a? You know, they named the crater on the dark side after Parsons. Didn't they name a crater or something like that, or something on Saturn after Cthulhu? Did they do that? Yeah,
I don't know.
That's kind of cool.
I think that is this also my question is a genuine question. Is this where Tartaria comes from?
Right, maybe.
Right?
I could go really into that. I mean, I'm not a proponent of that theory, but
Of course,
it's stupid.
fake and gray. Yes.
To actually, he does touch on aspects of things like that in his stories. There's a story, Polaris, that essentially is set in like Hyperborean times. You know, it's supposed to be just utterly archaic. And you don't know that at first. The narrator's describing he loves his position as the guard of the watchtower. He's so proud of his empire and serving the guard and everything. And one day he's looking up at this red planet. And I know that H.P. Lovecraft was into astronomy and into...
Oh, yeah.
Because the way he's talking about the stars, like he knows the stars by name. Like I can name a few. I know kind of what's
because
what,
it
but
backs up because it backs up his worldview of meaninglessness, the vast black ocean of nothing. We're just a speck of dust.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
We love that.
Yeah.
So I think it was Tristan or Jay did a funny video the other day. They're like, millions and millions of miles of blackness. You know, it's just so ridiculous. But like you know, those interjections kind of like added.
They found water on Mars, man.
Yeah, the water on Mars.
Water, it's life.
Yeah.
Never mind the life that no one cares about here.
Right.
So this story, Polaris, though, he's looking at this red star, red planet, and it's a demon's voice starts talking to him. The narrator says he starts hearing this evil voice, and it's telling him like it's luring him to sleep. It's saying, "Go to sleep, watchman," and he's like trying to resist it. He falls asleep. And it ends. This is a very quick story, Polaris. I would really recommend looking up the article.
It's like 1 to 3 pages, right?
Yeah, it's quick. It's 10 minutes to listen to. Probably even less to read.
He has a lot of like 2-page stories. He has a lot of those. Yeah.
Really good ones too. Very worth reading.
Those are my favorites because when they're long, it's like his lack of skill.
You gotta pause it, or you gotta put it down and go back to it. But these ones are very digestible. So. At the end of it, though, he's like the demons that are haunting him in this kind of mummified nightmare state that he's trapped in over the aeons. He's like kept alive, but he's in this nightmare state, and the demons are telling him like basically before he falls asleep, he's worried the whole time. He's like, "Oh, there's all these little creatures that are invading from the west. Like they'll never reach here. We're too powerful, and I'll never let down the guard." But then he falls asleep, and then the creatures or the demons that are taunting him in his dream are like, "Oh yeah, those creatures are here. They've been here for thousands of years now. They call themselves Eskimos." And you're just like, "Oh."
Yeah.
And as an archaeologist, like I find really cool old stuff a lot. So it's really cool for me to think about like those types of scenarios, because that is how reality, that's the overriding of cultures and waves of cultures and things like that. He plays on those, and he was very smart with his, like Henley said, his naming of characters, places, and things. Like, isn't Dagon?
That's a real god from the freaking like Babylon or Sumeria.
I know there's an African.
It's in the Bible. Dagon.
There's an African tribe called the Dogon
Yeah,
and their main deity
right.
is the fish god from space.
Right.
So,
Yeah, Dagon is the
yeah.
god of the abyss, right? In Sumeria, I believe. And yeah, the you'll see like not hieroglyphs, but like bas reliefs of the if you've ever seen it's like Sumerian men in like fish dresses. It's like they have this clothing on that makes them look like a fish. You can look up Dagon, and you'll see all sorts of stuff. It is a real thing. But not as he describes it. He took that name and made something else with it.
I'm
But
sure
yes.
Nick can speak about this, but the whole fish aspect is interesting. Also, I mean, you see that in you obviously see that the fish symbolism in Christianity, and you see
Yep.
it with the Celts, right?
Yep.
And the salmon, and the fish is obviously supposed to be, is symbolic of regeneration, resurrection,
Yep.
right, and of life. And you see that heavily, especially in the Old Testament.
Yep.
But I think that with these demons and with these like sort of demon creatures, it's a completely different thing.
Right.
And again, it represents like these sort of unknowable, unseeable demons from the abyss.
Yep.
Right. I mean, it's amazing with one thing Lovecraft really gets at is the fact that, I did this faux analysis last night for the sort of retelling of Robinson Crusoe, and there's a part where the character Susan Barton talks about like they're on the island and how she feels like it's like the island is floating through space, right? That she gets seasick on the island because she feels like the island is not firmly planted. And the irony is that she wants to go to England where she has roots, and England is also an island, right? And I think that Lovecraft really gets at that when he, you guys read one of the excerpts from one of the stories that talked about like that people are essentially islands, these like disconnected islands floating through space, and that space is the abyss right there. So Lovecraft himself like lives right on the seaboard, and he's on the island of Rhode Island, and there's all of this emptiness around him, and he's seeing that like this sort of is like a inverted or a reverse like firmament to give rise to these sort of demons that have this hold over human beings. I thought that was pretty interesting. Before I go on, shouts out to a couple people out there. Shouts out to Jack, who's in the chat, who again sponsored the stream. And Jack also brought up a good point a second ago. Oh, Jack brought up that Lovecraft and something about Lovecraft and Robert Howard. Was it Robert Howard? Weren't they friends? The guy who made Conan, weren't that
they
one
were
of like few friends? And didn't Howard also commit the S word at the end?
Yeah, so so Lovecraft did not kill himself. He didn't, but he basically did. But he did not. But I know we were talking about that before we did the stream. So then I went and I looked up known associates of Lovecraft, and I did not see his name anywhere. So I thought he was, but I could not confirm that he was. So.
Maybe they were pen pals. I mean, the guy wrote strongly worded.
But that's what I'm talking about, though. There's a list of his associates, and I didn't see his name on there, but I could have missed it. I could have swore he was, but I don't know.
They certainly were contemporaries, and they existed in
colleagues,
sort of same sphere, this sort of pulp fiction sphere.
Yeah.
And shouts out to a couple other people out there, big time supporters. Shouts out to William Kane out there, appreciate you. Shouts out to Ellie. Shouts out to Ellie, who supported me the other day. Thank you so much to Ellie, to Jethro, to Block Party, to my sister, to Kim. Shouts out to Maddie, Real Cooter Brown. Shouts out to everybody who supported us and who supported me after my, the thing that happened to me the other day, this car accident where the dude drove right into my fucking car. Excuse my language. So thank you. Thank you for supporting us. And Maddie, Real Cooter Brown asks, because he also donated, he says, what are each of y'all's favorite Lovecraft stories and why? So I'm going to let you guys take it away. Nick, why don't you start us off? What's your favorite Lovecraft and tell us why?
I think my favorite would be between The Mound and either Nameless City or Innsmouth, but I would probably say number one is The Mound.
All right, tell us about it.
Yeah, so The Mound is about basically main character goes to a town haunted by stories plaguing this particular really large earthworks mound from ancient Native American times, even before that, essentially, is what the character finds out. But there's all sorts of legends associated with it. People go missing near it. He winds up exploring it and basically finds a whole bunch of spooky stuff, discovers a whole hidden Hollow Earth complex, and there's all sorts of magical beings that are sort of like ghostly, ethereal, immortal human spirits that are kind of like based on Helena Blavatsky's Vril-Ya, people of the inner earth. A lot of similar lore there, and essentially he gets trapped down there. He doesn't want to stay there. It's kind of like Wicker Man down there, and they're like, "You must stay. We are not going to let you up and leave." And he's like, "Nope, I'm out of here." He falls in love with a girl down there, and then she helps him escape. But then the guards of the entrance to the mound at the top are basically like, "Yeah, no, we're not going to let you go." And
are there correlations? Like I can see, like just your description, because I haven't read that story. Is there a correlation between that and, like, for instance, the time machine, right, with the Morlocks?
It kind of is like that,
Yeah,
a little bit, except they're more like, I don't know if you've ever seen Riddick, but they're kind of like, what's her name's character, where she's like this druid ghost wind woman of the air, can teleport and kind of be psychic or whatever she's supposed to be. Yeah. They're like these immortal, magical, ghostly kind of people, and the townspeople up on the surface, it's like early 1900s in America, and they're all like, we see the ghosts of them Indians walking around the hill, and we don't go over there. And the character's like, sure, I'm gonna go check it out. Right. And then winds up finding out, yeah, that's real. But the Native American who he goes to beforehand is supposed to be this like 150-year-old guy who has this talisman. He's like, you got to wear this if you're going down there. Like, you're a crazy white boy, but here you go. Like, whatever, good luck. And it winds up working. So he goes back, gives it to him. And that guy is supposed to have survived that ordeal himself. So it ties into native lore. For me, as an archaeologist, it's my favorite because I go find mounds all the time.
I could tell right away in your description of the story that would be your favorite, because
I find cool stuff in the mounds. So I was just like, mounds.
Heck yeah. Yeah.
Right. Thank you. Appreciate that. What about you? Jared?
All right. Well, that was one of the stories I wanted to cover, was my favorite Lovecraft story, which is called The Whisperer in Darkness. And I love it because this one has more to do with space and actual like aliens from space. You know, not like Cthulhu, where yes, he comes from space, but he's under the water. He's been here for millennia, and this is basically his dominion. These creatures called the Migo are a blend between fungus and people, like a humanoid fungal animal sort of hybrid thing. Right. And I'm actually gonna, if it's okay with you guys, I'll read you guys the plot of it.
Tell us, buddy.
But I love it because it's a spooky, creepy story, and when you read it, it's written in the style of Bram Stoker's Dracula. So it's written, Henley, you'll know the name for the style, where it's written in letters between two people. Do you know the name of that?
Yeah,
what they call it?
Epistolary.
Yes, epistolary, right. And normally I don't like that style, but this style, or this use of that style is so great. It's pulled off so excellently because it's a slow burn where you start off and everything seems on the up and up. Everything seems like normal reality. And then as the letters get more and more into the story, there's just this unsettling nature about it. And you start to understand what's going on. And then one of the authors of the letter that he's writing, you start to question his truthfulness. And Henley, you've talked about this. There you go. Henley, you've talked about this in many of your analyses, where you talk about the unreliable narrator. And this definitely sort of plays into that, where you're reading these letters from this guy and you start to think, this guy is lying to me, or maybe this guy isn't this guy at all. Maybe this is somebody else. Right. So yeah, I'll read you the story. So the story is told by Albert N. Wilmarth, an instructor of literature at Miskatonic University in Arkham, Massachusetts. So Miskatonic University is a fake college that Lovecraft invented, and that's one of the things that ties a lot of his stories together, is Miskatonic and Arkham. Everybody knows Arkham from Batman. Well, that's where Batman gets Arkham from. Arkham is actually a Lovecraft reference.
Right.
So when local newspapers report strange things seen floating in rivers during a historic Vermont flood, Wilmarth becomes embroiled in a controversy regarding the reality and significance of the sightings. He sides with the skeptics, blaming old legends about monsters living in uninhabited hills that abduct people venturing too close to their territory. So yeah, the story starts out and there's reports of basically bodies, but they're not bodies because they're not people. They're things that are just washing up in these rivers after this flood. And you've got people going, those are the hill monsters.
Right.
You know, people in Vermont been talking about this for hundreds of years. Those hill monsters, you know. And the skeptics are going, no, what are you talking about? This is clearly some natural phenomena of leaves and weather balloons, and you know,
there's cryptids and hill monsters up there, eh? I don't know how
right. Right.
Huge.
So that's sort of the dynamic going on. Is you've got those sort of like backcountry, bucktooth hill people that believe in this ancient race of hill people, and then you've got the skeptic scientific people who are like, no, that's poppycock. So he receives a letter from Henry Wentworth.
Yeah. Good word.
Thank you. So he receives a letter from Henry Wentworth Akeley, a man who is one of these sort of bucktooth backcountry guys, a man living in an isolated farmhouse near Townsend, Vermont, who claims to have proof that will convince Wilmarth he must stop questioning the creature's existence. The two exchange letters that include an account of the extraterrestrial race chanting with human agents in worship of several beings, including Cthulhu and Nyarlathotep, the latter of whom shall put on the semblance of man, the waxen mask and the robe that hides. The agents intercept Akeley's messages and harass his farmhouse nightly. They exchange gunfire, and many of Akeley's guard dogs are killed, as are several of the agents. Later, Akeley reports having killed members of the extraterrestrial race, describing them as bleeding a sickly greenish fluid. Although Akeley expresses more in his letters, he abruptly has a change of heart. He writes that he has met with the extraterrestrial beings and has learned that they are peaceful. Furthermore, they have taught him of marvels beyond all imagination. He urges Wilmarth to pay him a visit and bring along the letters and photographic evidence that he had sent him. Wilmarth reluctantly consents. So he's talking to this guy, and this guy's like, yo, these things are bad news, bro, bad news. And then all of a sudden he's like, these things are great. Hey, would you bring those letters I wrote you and those pictures of those things I sent you? Could you come here and bring those? So clearly they're trying to get the evidence, right? They're like, come on over. And he's like, yeah, sure, I guess I'll come, you know. Wilmarth arrives to find Akeley in a pitiful physical condition, immobilized in a chair in complete darkness. Akeley tells Wilmarth about the extraterrestrial race and the wonders that they have revealed to him. He also says that the beings can surgically extract a human brain and place it into a canister wherein it can live indefinitely and withstand the rigors of outer space travel. So he's saying, yeah, not only are these things awesome, but they can cut your brain out, right? And they can put it in a jar, and that's you, and you're alive. And so your body, it can't handle space travel, but this jar can, and your brain in the jar can. So you can actually go to the farthest regions of the universe and live forever and see all of the wonders of the universe, right? And they're going to let me do it, and they're going to let you do it, and they'll let anybody do it. They're awesome. Like, they'll put your brain in a jar and fly you to Pluto.
It's the OG Coon Pod.
Right. But yeah.
It's like a combination of transhumanism and Heaven's Gate.
Right.
Jump on a common hail bop and you'll be all right.
Hail bop. Right. So, okay, and he shows proof to Wilmarth. Akeley says he had agreed to undertake such a journey and points to a cylinder bearing his name. So he's telling him, yeah, I actually am going to do this. And you see that cylinder right there? My brain's going to go in there. Let's see, cylinder. Okay. Wilmarth also listens to a brain in a cylinder as it speaks by way of an attached speaker of the positive aspects of the journey and why Wilmarth should join it in the trip to Yuggoth, the being's outpost in our solar system, later revealed to be Pluto. During these conversations, so let me get into that. So at this time that Lovecraft was writing this, Pluto had just been discovered. So right. Lovecraft gets the idea that planet is Yuggoth, and that's where these creatures are going to have come from.
Pluto is also hell world. Pluto is the Roman name, right, for the underworld. Yeah. And it's interesting that it ties in with, Dante's ninth circle, because Pluto is named for hell because it's so far out that it's cold, right? Just like in
Right.
Dante's Ninth Circle, it's Satan frozen in ice. It's so hot that it's cold. That's interesting.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. So here he is. He's telling him about the jar, and he goes, "Here, look, I'll prove it to you. I've got a brain in a jar right here. Talk to him. Have a conversation with him." So he actually starts having a conversation with this brain in a jar, speaking through speakers. Okay, so during these conversations, Wilmarth feels a vague sense of uneasiness, especially from Akeley's odd manner of buzzing whispering. So he's having a conversation with this guy he's been writing letters with all this time, and his voice just sounds weird, buzzing. It just sounds weird. During the night, because he spends the night. During the night, a sleepless Wilmarth overhears a disturbing conversation with several voices, some of which are distinctly bizarre. So he's trying to sleep upstairs, and he hears a clattering. He goes up to the door, and he's trying to listen. And he's like, there's like 4 or 5 people down there. Like, what the hell's going on? And the voices have that same sort of buzzing quality to them. Once all is silent, he creeps downstairs to investigate. He finds that Akeley is no longer present, but the robe he was wearing is discarded in the chair. Upon a closer look, he makes a horrifying discovery amid the folds of the robe, which sends him fleeing the farmhouse by stealing Akeley's car. When the authorities investigate the next day, they find nothing but a bullet-riddled house. Akeley has disappeared, along with all physical evidence of the extraterrestrial presence. As the story concludes, Wilmarth discloses the discovery, from which he fled in terror: Akeley's discarded face and hands. These were utilized by something inhuman to disguise itself as a man. He now believes with a dreadful certainty that the cylinder in the dark room with that whispering creature already contained the brain of Henry Wentworth Akeley. So basically, these monsters took his face and hands, and that's why the room was so dark, and they were like talking to him, and it was just this alien. And what this plot doesn't tell you is that these aliens are called the Migo, the dreaded Migo from Yuggoth, or the fungi from Yuggoth, because they were like part fungus or whatever. They not only did they have wings designed for space travel, so these things literally flew through space. They had this vast library, basically, in on Yuggoth, where they would go to all these different planets, and they would find intellectuals and scientists in these planets, and they would take their brains out into a jar, and they'd fly them back to their planet where they had this massive library, and they would have these brains write down the story of their race. And so their library was this vast collection of all the stories in the known universe.
Damn, dude, that reminds me of my 9th grade biology teacher. This dude had brains in a jar in his classroom.
Really?
Oh yeah.
Damn.
And I remember I went in and I was like, Mr. McGuire, what's up with that brain in that jar? And he was like, well, you don't know what DNA is? You need to define DNA and RNA, son.
My Dunna and my Arna.
Brains in the classroom. So what? He had a walleye.
But so yeah, that's my favorite story, and I think you guys can see why. It's a freaking creepy, awesome story.
Yeah, that's pretty cool, man.
That's a cool one, dude.
Yeah, it also reminds me of that AJ quote. I mean, it reminds me of a few different things, but one is, this Westworld transhumanist idea where, you're uploading your consciousness into a mainframe, right? Which is basically like, they take your pineal gland and upload it into a mainframe so that they can re-upload it into your body once they redo it, right? But it's also like what remember AJ's quote about are human beings cool? Think about it, right? We're basically a human meat sack made up of our ancestors to carry our brain around in.
Yeah.
Isn't that wild? Right.
Yeah.
So no, that was good. That was cool, Jerry. Thank you.
Yeah. There's some great Lovecraft films out there. Yeah. Shadow over Innsmouth is probably the most famous Lovecraft story, next to At the Mountains of Madness and Call of Cthulhu. No film has really ever done it well, but the best Shadow over Innsmouth film is called Dagon by Stuart Gordon, so I highly recommend checking that out. There's also a sort of low budget collective, I believe they call themselves the H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society. They actually made a silent film version of The Call of Cthulhu, which is done, and it was done in the style of silent films of that era. So they really tried to make it look like a silent film from the 20s and 30s. And they also made a Whisperer in Darkness film. They're real schlocky and cheesy, and they're low budget, but it's fun to watch it if you really love the material.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't I don't have like I'm of course these guys are the high IQ experts on Lovecraft, and so I don't have a favorite Lovecraft. I'd say that if I did have a favorite, it would probably be the Dagon story.
Mm.
But I think that what I would say what I appreciate most about Lovecraft would be number one, how far his work, his literature has permeated into the public consciousness, especially in terms of what we know of what we were talking about earlier in terms of the occult, and how it was sort of co-opted and used, as part of the occult, and how that can give us a worldview in terms of how we understand these perverts, right? But also how far the Lovecraftian mythos is like permeated into film. And one thing is that earlier Jerry and I were talking, and you brought up John Carpenter's The Thing, how that's a Lovecraftian story. And one thing that comes to mind, I mentioned The Abyss earlier, which is not really Lovecraftian, but it is in terms of they're in the abyss and they have these creatures. Of course, it's like a water, a water alien demon creature, but also a recent work would be Annihilation, right? Alex Garland's Annihilation that Jay covered, and how Annihilation is essentially another sort of a transhumanist story, about people going into space and going onto this far colony that becomes like Color Out of Space, and that they end up with this Crowleyan third eye BUTT stuff, inversion hole that's like sort of sucking human beings into the demonic realm. And that was pure. I mean, the imagery in that at the end, especially, is pure Lovecraftian. Also, I mean, the X-Files obviously has a lot of Lovecraftian symbolism. There's a whole episode about like the humanoid Squidward sucking creature that they find in the water supply. It's like a fishman demon.
Dude, modern horror, it owes so much to Lovecraft that people know of Lovecraftian themes, even if they've never heard of Lovecraft. So much of what he did for the first time has just it's just created modern horror. The whole sort of cosmic horror aspect of it, the unknown things. Who loves Lovecraft is Stephen King. And Stephen King was heavily inspired by him. He actually tried his hand at a few Lovecraftian stories set in the mythos.
I think Jordan Peele also is a big Lovecraft. I mean, I haven't seen any of Lovecraft Country, the show, the HBO show. I haven't seen it.
I haven't either.
But I know it borrows Lovecraft imagery specifically.
Oh yeah.
I would put Lovecraft for horror where C.S. Lewis or Tolkien are for adventure literature.
100%. And that's what's so crazy is even though he was not acknowledged at all in his lifetime, like he is now regarded as like,
Well, he fits into that pantheon of artists, who receive no sort of little or no praise or attention during their lifetime, but who influence culture heavily and in ways that I think are even in a way kind of covert. I mean, Rimbaud did this. Look at Vincent van Gogh, right?
I was about to say Van Gogh is the biggest example of that.
Or as they call him in England, Van Gogh.
Van Gogh.
Van Gogh. So we have these troubled characters who die young, who are psychologically and spiritually tortured, it seems, and who and who influence culture in such a huge way. So that's what I think about Lovecraft.
Before you even said that, Emily's in the back. She goes, Van Gogh.
Yeah.
I'm like, all right.
Shouts out to some other people who have supported us. Let's see. Shouts out to William Kane again. Shouts out to Maddie Maddie Real Cooter Brown. Let's see. Shouts out to let's see. Somebody else sent us a super chat here. Shouts out to Rachel, base homeschool mom. Thank you so much for supporting us. She said, thank you for the excellent entertainment to get me through part of my drive home, gentlemen. And we love you, base homeschool mom. And again, I'm sorry that I couldn't be there this weekend. And I love your updates and pictures, and you guys had so much fun. And shouts out to everybody who made it out there to the J event. right to Dire Stock in Nashville. And, you know, I won't go on about how much I lament not being able to go there because I said it all last night. I'm going to quit bitching about it. But, you know, we're all part of this this pretty tight community here. And I'm especially thankful that my two homeboys here could join us tonight. So so we're going to go into the sort of our closing thoughts here. What do you guys want to bring up that we haven't covered about Lovecraft or Lovecraft literature?
Man, I covered most of the main points I wanted to cover. I mean, I could go on and on and on about stories I love of his. But yeah, I would just double down on the fact that he is incredibly important to modern horror. And if anybody really likes horror as a genre, I highly recommend reading his stuff, just because even though he's not the most talented author, it's just important to know, or it's good to know, you know. And if you're into that genre, you'll enjoy it. So
you mentioned earlier that, you know, a beginner should start probably with Dagon, right?
Yeah. A lot of the shorter stories. I actually have a list. See, because I have a bunch of different books of his style. I have a book of his poems, and then I have the complete fiction. And in my complete fiction, I have a piece of paper because I used to recommend Lovecraft so often that I actually had a list of stories that I would recommend to somebody who's never read him before, and I'd hand them the list, and I'd be like, read this first, and then read this, and then read this. Right. Yeah. You know. Yeah.
What about you, Nick? What do you think?
Well, I think we really did cover the majority of what I had in my mind too. I guess, you know, it's important to keep in mind he had a troubled backstory, so that really shaped his materialistic views. But his writings, you know, obviously, like Jerry said, you know, he's might not be the best storyteller in that sense, but the way he paints words draws you in. Absolutely an author worth reading or listening to his audiobooks. I would recommend starting with either Nameless City is a relatively shorter one, I would say. That's just my 10 cents. That's the one I started with, and it sucked me right in. Very cool story. But there's tons of shorter ones.
You mentioned J.R.R. Tolkien earlier, and I think it's another interesting aspect is the fact that, like, there was this great, you know, coming together in terms of culture at the time of these people who created, you know, a language and a mythos and a universe, you know, all their own. We see that now, especially with, you know, in this sort of, I think now kind of a post golden age of like television streaming services, for example. I think we hit the high watermark with that, and now we see it for what it is, which is essentially just a propaganda vehicle. But I think that, you know, that there's certainly Lovecraft certainly influenced Hollywood in literature in terms of, you know, and sci-fi and fantasy in terms of creating this language all of his own, right? That is unique to him. I mean, we see that with what's his name, George R.R. Martin, and with Frank Herbert, and even with, you know, with Stephen King, and his dairy locus, right? So I think that's pretty interesting. You know, I don't really know much about, like, not show Lovecraft Country per se, but about, you know, his place names, and I think that would be an interesting thing to discover. I see a lot of that, you know, in terms of real life, like I mentioned with Tangier Island and the South and with Southern Gothic. And in a way, I think Lovecraft is kind of a Northeastern version of a Southern Gothic writer in a number of ways. So I think that's pretty interesting. So you guys want to give a shout out one more time? Tell everybody where they can find you.
So
you go first.
All right. So everybody, it's Exposing Powerful Lies, live streams. Please come and subscribe to my channel and check out my streams that we do. Hopefully have BLA here come on sometime again in the near future. And me and Nick are actually going to be doing a stream coming up. We haven't set a date yet, but we're going to be doing a stream on one of my ancestors, actually, Chief Clinton Rickard of the Tuscarora clan, or the Tuscarora tribe. I'm really excited about that one. That's going to be a lot of fun.
Cool.
That's pretty awesome. Yeah, you mentioned how Nick brought that up to you and has
He sent a picture of my great uncle's autobiography, and I'm like, "Where'd you get that?"
That's
So
I'm learning the Jerry back lore. I'm like, I'm just joking.
pretty awesome.
so
But
yeah, and
I absolutely would love to do that stream, man. I think that's so cool that you have that connection to that history.
yeah, he has a statue in Niagara Falls, and my family visits it every year, and you know, it's really a big part of our family, and so I'm excited to cover that.
And
stuff
it's a statue. It's not a weird Tartarian
Yeah,
obelisk.
it's not Cthulhu on a pedestal.
Jerry knows the secret lore of the places under the statue.
Yeah, right. But yeah, we you know, we do live streams and we have fun, and like Henley said, it's a close knit group of friends, and that's basically what my channel is. You know, is it's almost like a hangout. It's almost like a meeting place. You know, a lot of our channels are like that. You know, where it's not about blowing up the channel and get. All right. It's not about, you know, blowing up the channel and getting famous, and it's really just about having fun and meeting cool people for me. And so, you know, come join the fun, and that's where we do it. You can find me on Instagram as Exposing Powerful Lies, and and Twitter as Exposing Powerful Lies, and that's pretty much it. Yeah, there's my uncle. There's Clint.
That's Jerry's great uncle, guys. That's cool.
Great uncle, actually. I misspoke.
Uncle. So cool.
All right.
Thank you. All right, so Nick, Green Feathers, tell us where we can find you.
Yeah, so literally just my YouTube channel, the Green Feathers, all one word. If you search it right in the YouTube search bar, you'll see my face right there. If anybody wants to post a link to it, someone probably already did. Yeah, that's pretty much it. My wife and I do a lot of live painting streams. This is some of her lovely artwork right here. And I have a whole bunch of other content. Check it out.
Awesome. So thank you, Jerry, Exposing Powerful Lies, live streams. Thank you to Nick, the Green Feathers. Thank you again. Shouts out to all our homies out there, especially the ones who have supported me in the past few days. Thank you to Jethro, Block Party Vintage, Mixkey, Ellie, Kim, Rachel, Base Homeschool Mom, Kristen, Crispy. Shouts out to Jack for supporting the stream. Thank you to Maddie Real Cooter Brown. Thanks to everybody. Shouts out to Jay's Analysis, of course, to David Patrick Harry, Church of the Eternal Logos, to Tristan at Primal Edge Health. Shouts out to my best friend in the whole world, T-Dubs, Big Woody out there. I love you, homeboy. Shouts out to Paul, my long-term, one of my oldest friends who introduced me to J.M. Kutsea and his books in 2000 that I covered last night. Shouts out to Rollin. Shouts out to my sister. Shouts out to everybody out there. We love you so much. And in the coming days and weeks, I'll be covering more Shakespeare. I mentioned last night that I'm going to try to cover all of Shakespeare's 37 plays. I'm going to be doing The Tempest coming up, and also we're going to be closing out Shakespeare's his quarto of tragedies with Othello. I'll also be covering Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash, which gave us the term Avatar. It's a dystopian techno novel, and Herman Hesse, and much, much more. If you're interested in sponsoring a stream like our buddy Jack did tonight, please drop a fat super chat. And thank you to everybody who supported us. Please share the stream, like it, leave us a comment, and also go back and watch me and the Green Feathers. We did a recent stream on Northern Ireland and the Troubles, and then also Jerry and I did the Crucible, and shouts out to Andy BPF. So thank you, everybody. We love you up there. We love you guys. Thank you so much, and shouts out to my two homeboys right here. That's about all we got. Peace, y'all. Love y'all. See you. Peace.